Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this special Lunch and Learn. My name is Deborah Jensen. I'm the chair of the project steering committee that is overseeing the Institute's professional governance, research, and engagement project. I'd like to start today by acknowledging that the Planning Institute of British Columbia recognizes and appreciates that we are able to live, work, and learn on the traditional territories of the First Nations and Indigenous peoples of BC and the Yukon. Acknowledging the principles of truth and reconciliation, we recognize and respect the history, languages, and cultures of the First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all Indigenous peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our lives and our country. We further acknowledge that the Institute's offices are located on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Before we continue today, we would like to acknowledge the tragedy that happened in our province. So please join us in a moment of silence to honor the victims and their families in Tumbler Ridge. We're going to turn off our cameras and we will be back shortly. Thank you, everyone. I think in moments like this, we're reminded that we really have so much in common, more than we do differences. Our love for our kids, our family, our neighbors, and from a professional perspective, just our pursuit and protection of the public interest. So, in moments like this, I would certainly encourage everyone to find your own way of providing support for yourself, for your others, and to ask for that support if you need help in dealing with the events that happened. So for today, I'd like to thank everyone again for taking time out of your busy day to join us. You're here today for the webinar, but in addition to the webinar today, we are launching an engagement survey and we'll be posting the consultant report on the PIBC website, which you're going to hear more about today. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but first I'd like to invite our PIBC's president, Kenna Jonkman, for her opening remarks. Kenna.
Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the board, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. PIBC is a society governed by the Societies Act. PIBC has title protection for the RPP designation and provides a number of member services, including setting out a professional code of ethics and professional conduct. The topic of professional governance, or how a profession is regulated, has been of interest to the board for PIBC for many years. In 2023, the board approved direction to undertake a formal analysis of the opportunities and implications for the profession and the Institute with regards to being regulated under the Professional Governance Act. The steering committee was formed and has been conducting research and engagement to collect relevant information since this time. Updates on the project have been presented to the board, and it is anticipated that the steering committee will present this round of engagement findings back to the board for their March meeting. Presenters today will talk about the findings of the work and what it would mean for the planning profession to be regulated by the Professional Governance Act. The board has taken no position on whether to apply or not apply for the designation under the PGA at this point, nor has the province indicated any direction. I would like to thank you for taking your time today participating in the session, and I will hand it back to Deborah.
Thank you, Kenna. For everyone's benefit, I'm just going to run through a little bit of the background about this project. So, as Kenna noted, the board authorized this project in 2023, and the work plan that was prepared was endorsed the following year. So, since then, over the last 15 months, we have engaged our membership in multiple ways. We started with an initial survey. We held a first webinar in spring of 2025. That was followed by a session at the PIBC conference later on that year. We've had many one-on-one meetings with some of the other PIBC standing committees. We've tried to keep the membership up to date via regular articles in the Planning West. I believe there's been a total of 4 so far, as well as quarterly update memos that have gone to the board and are posted on the project website. Early on in the process, we created a 20-page FAQ that was made available to the membership through the website as well. One of the major tasks through this phase was to retain a consultant to undertake a more fulsome strategic assessment about this particular topic. And to do that, PIBC retained the regulator's practice in August of 2025, and they have since done an extensive amount of qualitative research, which included facilitating 9 focus groups with our membership and other non-members last fall. And to that, I am pleased today to have our consultant team here today to present you the key findings and options from their work. So in terms of next steps, this webinar is kicking off the next piece of engagement that we're undertaking. As I noted earlier, PIBC is launching a second engagement survey today, and we'll be distributing that link to the consultant's report as well. So you will have the opportunity to have a look at that report and to participate in the survey. So you'll be getting a special e-news this afternoon around 2 p.m. And I would certainly encourage you to send that along to your fellow peers or to other members you know of in your professional networks that might be of interest in completing that survey or taking a look at the report. And now, based on that, I'd like to introduce our consultant team. So they can certainly turn their cameras on now. For your information, the Regulator's practice is a consultancy firm that provides advice and services on professional governance matters. Bradley Chisholm is the founder and principal of TRP. For the last decade, Bradley has worked with professional regulators across the country, including the Office of the Superintendent of Professional Governance, the PGA, the BC Ministry of Health, and the Yukon government. Most recently, Bradley has served as the Chief Officer, Strategy and Governance for the newly formed BC College of Nurses and Midwives. Katya Masnyk is an experienced regulator, executive leader, and researcher with over 20 years of experience in professional regulation across both health and non-health professions. She has worked with a diversity of organizations, including the Applied Science Technologists and Technicians of British Columbia, and most recently served as the Director of Policy, Engagement, and Strategic Implementation at the Ontario College of Pharmacists. So before I turn it over to Bradley and Katya, I know there are people out there who have a lot of interest and differing perspectives about the topic of professional governance. And that's great for us to see. We've really appreciated all the feedback that we're getting from the membership. For this webinar, what I would encourage you to do is to focus on the consultant's presentation and submit any questions you may have in the Q&A box, and you'll find that at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to address those questions at the end of the presentation. You can also engage in dialogue with fellow attendees in the chat box, but just note that we will not be actively monitoring nor moderating the chat box for questions, so you're better to use the Q&A box for that. I would strongly encourage everyone to engage in a respectful and professional manner. Let's continue to set a high standard for constructive discussions that we've had so far and match that standard that we expect when we're working in our communities as professional planners. Lastly, just for your information, we will be recording the webinar and posting it on PIB's website, so you can likely access that next week. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bradley and Katya.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just going to share our slide deck. Thank you very much. We're really honored to be a part of this process. As Deborah said, the regulator's practice was really created because we believed there was a gap in Canada around good governance, research and learning, and policy support that really focused on professional regulation. And so we do work with regulators from coast to coast to coast, but we also work with some governments and ministries within those governments around thinking through some of the bigger questions around building regulatory frameworks from which different professions will be regulated. And like Deborah said, we have done some work with the OSPG in BC. We've done work with the Ministry of Health around their new piece of legislation. And so it's really an honor to, again, work with a professional organization that is trying to be really intentional about this process and asking these questions and ensuring that the decision maker, and we'll talk about who the decision maker is in this case, because there's multiple different gates of decision making, but making sure that people who are making the decisions are doing so with their eyes wide open, have a really good handle of the pros and cons of the various decisions and the implications. And I think that at the high level, in terms of our findings, we were not asked to provide an opinion or to give a recommendation. We were really asked to provide information that we believed would help your board and you as members inform good decision-making along this path. So we might have our opinions on certain things, but we've really tried to keep our opinions out of it to really provide good information from multiple different perspectives. This is not an easy decision to make. One of the things that we've been really heartened by is the passion of the profession around these questions.
Bradley, sorry to interject, but your presentation is showing really small on your screen.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I think I shared the wrong screen here. Thank you. Let me try that again. Is that better? There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. I have multiple screens and it plays tricks on me. So I just wanted to say that one of the things we've been heartened by is the engagement of the profession, the desire to make intentional decisions and do it properly, and the differing perspectives around this question. And I think there's lots of really well-reasoned perspectives that are different. And so regardless, even with more and better information, this is going to be a difficult decision. And I think it will be a difficult decision for your organization, but it'll also be a difficult decision for government because there's a number of factors that they will need to be paying attention to. So in terms of today, what we wanted to do, this is kind of the flow of our session. We'll talk a little bit about the project to date, the project we've been engaged in, which is kind of a piece of a bigger project that PIBC is engaged in to support this decision. In order to do that, we're going to take a bit of a step back and look at the professional regulatory landscape more generally across Canada. And what are some of the things that have been happening in that broader perspective that actually do influence this decision in a number of ways. These factors have influenced the creation of this new piece of legislation, or relatively new piece of legislation, the Professional Governance Act. But it also is important in terms of how the Professional Governance Act is being interpreted and how the various decision makers are, making some of those decisions. So context is really important here. And so we're going to provide some of that context for you. Then we're going to talk about what we call the layers of decision making. What are the different decision makers as part of this process? And what are the different factors that they will be paying attention to when they're making those decisions? I'm then going to hand things over to Katya, who's really been the lead on the research of this report, to walk you through the elements at a high level. It's a pretty extensive report. So at a high level, the elements and key findings of the report. Then I will talk briefly about the decision that is now before the board that your board is going to have to be making in the months ahead, and then open it up for discussion and questions. And we're available to answer any of those questions, and so is Deborah. So let's dig in. So the first piece is really around the project to date and kind of the process that we've been working on since we were engaged in this project. The first element of our research really incorporated a literature review, looking at some of the literature, the gray literature that's out there in terms of the kind of state of play of professional regulation in Canada and globally. But also then that tied into a jurisdictional scan, both a Canadian and an international jurisdictional scan about how planning is being regulated. The next phase was really conversations, conversations with key informants across the country, people who have had experience in BC implementing the Professional Governance Act, other planning regulators across the country that have a unique perspective that might have different ways of regulating the planning profession in their province and some of the strengths and weaknesses of those differences. So some really engaging discussions with those stakeholders. And then an operational review, which was really working with the PIBC staff to understand what some of the consequences would be of these changes. And that's also incorporating some of the realities that other regulators in BC have experienced when they have come under the PGA. That all led us to the focus groups, which I suspect many of you were a part of, that Katya facilitated, where we were really engaging with members of the profession and getting your perspective on, because you're a pretty key element to this. So really understanding what are some of the things that are important to you, what are some of the fears that you have and concerns that you have of a shift like this, and what are some of the things that you really hope that the board pays attention to, when they're having these conversations moving forward. That then led us to the report writing phase, where we tried to integrate very different pieces of feedback. So something that you will want to look at when you look at the report is that many of the inputs, I'll call it, are very different. The literature review, the jurisdictional scan, focus group. So each input, we've tried to summarize the outputs of those inputs in a way that's best for decision makers. And so they're kind of summarized differently. And so you'll see that in the report. So we really tried to synthesize those reports and provide any other considerations or observations from our experience. So that's really been the process to date. We were able to meet with the subcommittee to provide to debrief our report. And we were also able to meet with the board a couple weeks ago in order to do the same. And now we're meeting with you. So I want to talk a little bit about the broader perspective in terms of what's happening in the professional regulatory world. And I have to say a lot is happening. I started working exclusively with professional regulation about 12 years ago. And at that time, it felt like regulators were kind of operating under the radar. Unless something really bad happened, regulators weren't getting a whole lot of attention from either the public or government. And I think in the last decade, that has dramatically shifted. I think that regulators are under the radar, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think that there are examples and public perceptions of decisions that regulators have made that are misaligned with public expectations. A great example of this, I think, is as the Me Too movement became a part of our dialogue and expectations as a society, rightly, I think we started having a more sensitivity to how organizations like professional regulators were making decisions in light of findings of sexual misconduct, for example. And public starting to see decisions that regulators were made where perhaps there was a finding of sexual misconduct, but all of a sudden this practitioner had to be supervised for a couple of months and then was able to go back to regular practice. And the public was saying, this doesn't align. Our expectations of what the consequences of something like sexual misconduct should be doesn't align with what these sanctions are that the regulators are putting in place. So that misalignment. I think we also had started to be skepticism of what, and I'll come back to this, but trust in traditional association governance structures. So, we see a complaint going forward, let's say about a doctor, and all of a sudden the public is looking at who's on the panel making decisions about how this doctor is going to be treated. And they kind of see this is kind of doctors taking care of doctors rather than the public having oversight of this profession. And so starting to question some of the ways that these professional regulators were structured and not really trusting that anymore. We've seen governance dysfunction playing out publicly. We have a report in British Columbia from 2018 by one of our senior advisors, Harry Caton, about the College of Dental Surgeons of BC. That really flagged some pretty significant governance dysfunction that existed and the public impact of that dysfunction. Basically, a distracted regulator because the board's dysfunction. We've seen that across the country. We've seen it very recently with certain regulators where some of that public dysfunction, governance dysfunction has really played out. An example is the Law Society of Ontario recently, where the board president felt that they could make decisions about the salary of the CEO without the consultation or approval of the board, and it causing major dysfunction. So these types of stories, again, make the public and government wonder, are we doing this public protection thing? Are we doing this professional regulation thing in the right way? Priorities misaligned with public expectations. There's examples of regulators going down a path that might be the legally compliant path, but what the public is looking at is this where these regulators should be spending their attention? Another example, the regulator of nurses in Saskatchewan pursuing a Facebook post of one nurse talking poorly about another nurse that cared for her father, and that going all the way through appeals processes to the Court of Appeal of Saskatchewan. I suspect costing almost $1 million in legal fees, and the public sitting back and government saying, was that really worth it? Is that where we want our regulators paying attention? We have harm to the public that's tied to regulatory failure. So we're seeing regulatory failure. In BC, we have examples where government decided that the regulator failed and taking the regulation of those professions into government again. We have the example of teachers in around 2005, where government decided that the College of Teachers was not able to make decisions in the public interest and move that into government. We have realtors in BC more recently. So we have these examples where, again, the public and government have decided, not just worried about public protection, but decided that they were better suited to regulate the public, regulate these professions in the public interest. And then I think this leads me to the next point, where we've seen decisions that impact and are misaligned perhaps with where government priorities are. So we start seeing government wanting to intervene because the impacts of what regulators are doing or their positions on things might not be aligned. And we have lots of different stories. More recently, we have In Alberta, a piece of legislation that Bill 13 is what people are referring it to, even though it's the legal name is the Regulatory Neutrality Act, which is government intervening because they felt that regulators were constraining things like freedom of speech too much. And so we have the regulators moving in a direction that is different than where government is moving, and all of a sudden those regulators are in the spotlight again. And that brings me to the second point, is that I think what we have seen, and a reason why there's more of a public policy interest in professional regulation, is because we have this intersection of regulation and public policy, broader public policy. And we've seen it on a number of different perspectives, not on this list, but I think pretty obvious that I lived through being with the College of Nurses at the time was the pandemic, where you have regulators playing a pretty significant role in protecting the public at a time of a pandemic. But we also see things like labor supply and mobility. You know, nationally and provincially, we see labor mobility being a significant issue, but then all of a sudden we start seeing these interprovincial and international barriers to mobility that we start to think might be restraining access and supply of certain professionals. So all of a sudden, how we regulate is connected with that conversation. Access to services, so whether it's access to justice or access to planning services or access to healthcare services, again, tied to mobility and tied to supply of different professionals, all of a sudden we see government starting to pay attention and the public paying attention, where we think that different regulatory barriers might result in reduced access to the services. We have the infrastructure question across the country, but in BC especially, we have a new Infrastructure Act. We have a new private members bill that speaks to the need for more professional reliance to fast track different infrastructure projects. That infrastructure conversation is not separate and apart from these types of conversations about what professions need to be regulated under the PGA. Environmental protection. Environmental protection is one of the underlying reasons why the Professional Governance Act was created, because the government saw some failures, professional failures, that they actually attributed to a lack of professional reliance and a lack of issues with conflict of interest, and a need for better regulation of certain professionals. Cost of living, again, we touch on this in some of our work, our research around government is going to be asking the question that would increased regulation or different types of regulation have an impact on cost of housing, cost of living. We see reconciliation, Indigenous reconciliation being a real key issue for governments across the country. And again, starting to ask the question, what role do regulators play in those efforts? And we see even new piece of legislation in BC, the Health Professions Occupations Act, that specifically incorporates the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act right into the legislation. It creates a goal for professional regulators, like the actual objective of that act is to protect people from harm and discrimination. So these are things that didn't exist before, that kind of clarity and ensuring that regulators were using reconciliation as an important lens to consider in their decision making. And then I talked about the freedom of speech piece around, Alberta especially, but regulators starting to get pressure on being more clear in terms of what their responsibilities are and are not with respect to the freedom of speech of their practitioners. So again, we see these shifts. We see shifting public expectations. We see regulation connecting with big public policy issues that governments and the public are paying attention to. All of those things kind of put regulation under a spotlight that I think we have been a bit immune from before this last decade. The other piece that I think is important as well, and should be important with, I think regulators have to always ensure that they sustain trust of the public, but that they are relevant to the profession. And being relevant to the profession means that you need, as a regulator, to be staying abreast of how the practice is changing. And so, things like, are professionals working as individuals, or are they working in teams? We see in some professions, the corporatization of the professional practice. We see in pharmacy and in dentistry, for example, in engineering, more large corporations that might actually create some different ways that we need to be regulating, because we don't have these sole practitioners out there working autonomously anymore. They're working under the umbrella of a corporate entity that might not even be Canadian. That might be an international corporation that thinks very differently about professional practice. We have dramatically shifting risks, and with the exponential change of technology that we are seeing, artificial intelligence being one of them, that the impact of that is a dramatic shift in the risk profile of practitioners' work. So AI, just as one example, is eliminating certain risks that a regulator needed to pay attention to in years past. It's introducing new risks that perhaps we didn't need to be paying attention to, and it's changing the risk profile of certain things that practitioners are doing that just mean we might need to regulate those things differently. Regulators have to be paying attention to those things. And then what we're also seeing is more overlap in terms of scopes of practice. We're seeing that there's not the same clean lines between different types of professionals that used to exist. That has made the regulation of professions much more complex and difficult. So lastly, and I've talked about this a bit, another reason why I think we see some of the changes that I'll talk about is that there is a recognition of the weaknesses of association governance in when those organizations are charged with protecting the public interest. So how professional regulators were created in Canada, they were often associations that regulated, similar to PIBC now. But as that's evolved, these organizations, like the regulators that are under the PGA, are no longer associations. They are purely public interest regulators. But we've adopted a lot of the association governance frameworks, and that's created some confusion. So just for example, elections. So elections are a big part of association governance, so they should be. Elections are created to elect members of a board so that they can make decisions in the best interest of members. But if we put that same process in place for a regulator, we have a regulator that is making decisions in the public's interest, but members being elected by the profession. And what happens is there's real confusion at the board table because board members don't understand if their job is to protect the interests of the constituents that elected them or the public that they are legally charged with serving. And I think a lot of the governance challenges we see is because of that confusion. And that's confusing for the members as well, that you elect someone that's not going to be there to make decisions on your behalf. So we've started to see government pay attention to some of these issues that need to be rectified in the governance framework because it's not necessarily enabling good public interest decisions. There's some risk and vulnerabilities there. So what are some of the changes that we've seen in Canada in the last 10 years? So the last slide was really about why are we in the spotlight. This is more about what are some of those specific changes that we've seen, not just in BC, but more broadly. I talked about the realtors and the teachers in BC. We've seen regulation be brought back into government in certain cases. We've seen what we call a rebalancing of authority. So we really see three major players in any regulatory regime. There's the public, government, and the profession. And a lot of the changes that we've seen, including the PGA here in BC, is a rebalancing of the authorities, of the powers. And it often is decreasing the power of the profession, increasing the influence and the power of the public, and increasing the influence and power of government. We've seen the separation of regulatory and association mandates. The PGA is a great example. The PGA, one of the key elements of it is that it forces an organization that becomes a PGA regulator to give up its advocacy responsibilities. You're no longer a member-based association. You become a public interest regulator. We see the centering of systemic racism, discrimination, cultural safety as regulatory outcomes. So I talked about the HPOA. The PGA is also an example. There's a lot of responsibilities that it puts on to regulators, but also the Office of the Superintendent in terms of safeguarding and moving reconciliation efforts forward. That's new in professional regulation. We've seen lots of governance modernization changes, elimination of elections, smaller boards, decreased member authority, so less things needing to go to members during AGMs and more decisions being housed at a board that has a fiduciary duty to make decisions in the public interest. Increasing public members on boards and committees, eliminating things like AGMs altogether that don't necessarily make sense in a regulatory world versus an association world. We see some provinces creating legislation to mandate outcomes for certain findings, like sexual misconduct. In Ontario and in Alberta, they have legislation now that if the health regulator, I think any regulator, finds sexual misconduct, there's a mandatory outcome. The regulator no longer makes that decision. And then the other big change that we're seeing is enabling and contemplating and sometimes mandating amalgamations. And so the creation of multi-professional regulators, that is somewhat new in Canada, not new in other countries, but new in Canada. And we've seen a number of those amalgamations in BC. So now kind of shrinking the focus and paying a little bit more attention to what's happened in BC in the last 5-6 years. We have 3 new pieces of professional governance legislation in BC. All of them are pretty significant. And I would say, in terms of looking across Canada, other Canadian jurisdictions are looking at these pieces of legislation with real interest and fear potentially for some people, but they're looking at it. The Professional Governance Act, which we'll talk about, the Health Professions Occupations Act, and the new Legal Professions Act. The major changes looking at all of those things is that shifting of the balance of power, which we talked about, increasing government oversight. We even have 2 superintendents now, one focused on health and one focused on the PGA. These are offices in government that specifically look at overseeing the profession. Clarification of the mandate, so clear public interest mandates, that separation of association. We have governance aligned with the public interest mandate, so starting to see some of these governance changes that are more association in nature, and open to multi-professional regulation. So all of these pieces of legislation, the Legal Professions Act brings the regulation of notaries, paralegals, and lawyers all under a single place. The PGA contemplates amalgamation, and government can actually force amalgamation if they think that's necessary. And the Health Professions Occupations Act is the same. And in that space, we've actually seen in the last 7 years, 21 health regulators in BC. Now there's 6. So a significant amalgamation of those smaller regulators. So in summary, around this context, I think it's just really important that people understand that being a self-regulated profession in BC under regulatory legislation like the PGA looks a lot different than if we were having this conversation 10 years ago. And I think that's just really important to keep in mind, that we're not talking about some myth of self-regulation. We're talking about the reality of self-regulation under this legislation right now. I won't speak to it now, but I think some of the major differences between regulation under your current act versus regulation under the PGA, we've outlined some of those key differences in the report, but I've talked about these major themes, and that's a good reference point. And if you have any specific questions, we're happy to touch on that. I wanted to dive into, and so that's kind of the background, the bigger context. I wanted to now start focusing on this question and the research that we've done for you. And the big thing, again, to keep in mind is, who are the decision makers here? And I think it's not as simple. You know, we started these conversations with, you know, can you please help us decide whether we want to do this or not? You know, whether we want to make an application for designation under the PGA or not. That's an important question. But what you also need to understand is not necessarily just what your decision-making gate is, but understand what happens after that. So even if you decide to make the decision to request, apply for designation under the PGA, that then goes to the Office of the Superintendent of Professional Governance, who will be making a decision as to whether they want to make a recommendation to their minister and to cabinet, but then it also ultimately becomes a cabinet decision. And so when we look at this, and again, this graphic is in the report that talks about specifically your process internally, but then what happens when it goes to government. But what I think is really important is a different way of looking at it. To me, every one of these elements has a bit of a different decision-making question. The board of your organization and you as members are asking the question, what is in the best interest of members and of the profession? That's the mandate of PIBC, is to make decisions to set both individual members and the profession up for success. But that's not the question that OSPG is going to be asking if they receive an application. They are going to be asking a very different question. And that is, from our perspective and research, looking at how they've made decisions in the past, is there a residual public risk that can only be adequately managed through professional regulation? So what does that mean? They are going to make their decision not what's best for the profession, but what's best for the public. And how they have done that is by doing a bit of a risk assessment. What is the risk to the public associated with the practice of planning? And the second question is, what other elements are in play that currently help to manage those risks? And is there gaps? And if there are gaps, is the best way to address those gaps with something like professional regulation? Recognizing it can be quite a blunt instrument if what is needed is something a little bit different. So the OSPG especially has been taking a very nuanced approach to this, because they recognize, and Katya will talk about this a bit, around there is a social impact of under-regulating, and there's a social impact of over-regulating a profession. And that's what, you know, they're looking at. When it goes to cabinet, we actually think there's a bit of a different question that they're asking as well. They're definitely going to be taking all of the information that the OSPG has given them, but they're going to be the ones that are looking at, how does this decision play with some of our other big public policy initiatives that are at play right now? So is professional regulation in the public interest? in the context of all of the other government policies that are currently in play. So again, in order for you as a profession to get to get designation and become a PGA regulator, government ultimately is the decision maker, and they have to look at not what's best for the profession. They are going to be looking at what is best for the public in the context of risk and the risk to the public, but also this broader question of all of these other things like housing affordability, like infrastructure development, like reconciliation, these bigger policy pieces. How does this play into all of that? So that is where I will hand things over to Katya, because I think with that context, we've tried to provide information in this report that actually, going back to this, is information that we know it will be important to your board when they're making a decision. But we're trying to anticipate some of the information that likely government will be paying attention to. Because, for example, if it is determined that even if we want to do this or not, that there's no way government is ever going to do this, why would you continue down this path of major change management and communication if the conclusion is that the government has no interest in regulating us? So that's kind of why we had to not only provide information that might be useful to the board, but also we have to try to look into what are the types of factors that government's going to be paying attention to too. So we've tried to lay all of that information out in our report. Would love to hand things over to Katya to talk about the report. This is the report that you're going to have access to as of 2:30 today or 2 o'clock today on your website. There's two reports. There's the actual report, and then there's a supplemental report that is more appendices. It has some really great information in there, but we didn't want it to be too overwhelming, so we split them up into two separate documents. But Katya, I'll hand things over to you.
Okay, thank you, Bradley. Can you go to the next slide for me, please? Thank you. So I'll start here. My job over the next 10 minutes or so is to speak at a high level about what we found in the various components of research that was conducted in order to prepare the analysis and the information that we were able to provide to the subcommittee and then to your board. So as Bradley mentioned, way at the very beginning, there are about 5 major initiatives or points to our research, ranging from the literature reviews and then going to the more interactive focus groups and key informant interviews. And I'll talk about them at a high level for you, where all of the detail, if you want any further information, can be found in the report. What I did want to do, though, for a minute before I launch into the findings is just spend a moment talking about the nature of qualitative research, because all of the pieces of research that we did and we completed, they're all qualitative in nature, not quantitative, and they follow the rules and the methods of qualitative research. And basically what that means for you, for the board, for decision makers, is that unlike quantitative research, which many of us are more familiar and more comfortable sort of with the concepts of quantitative research, there really is no ability to measure statistical significance and meaning in qualitative research, nor do the findings in qualitative research necessarily generalize to the broader population of all planners. What they can do, however, is to really give an in-depth, thick description of what people are experiencing who are working as planners at the coalface. So it gives us really important insights to what some of the concerns might be, what some of the issues confronting planners at the front lines might be. And it allows them to have this very focused, deeper look at what's happening out in the field. So the findings from the qualitative research that I'm about to talk about, they're very real to the people who are experiencing it. And these were things that professional planners wanted us to know. And so I present them to you with that caveat and with the understanding that these were the points of view of select people that we then incorporated into the broader analysis. Next slide. So a big part of what we took a look at is what is written in the literature about best practices in terms of regulation and best practices in terms of dual mandate or a single mandate regulators who work in the public interest. Bradley's covered quite a lot of this. So I really just want to take a moment to highlight two key findings from the literature that I think it's really important for you to know. First is that the regulation of professions is not a dichotomous yes or no kind of a decision. And instead, regulation exists along a continuum that's represented here by this purple arrow. So currently, the PIBC is located much more towards the left-hand side of this arrow, where you work fairly independently. You are guided by the Societies Act as well as PIBC's Constitution and bylaws. And through that Constitution and bylaws, you might not be explicitly working in the public interest. That's not part of your act. However, PIBC is definitely conducting regulatory functions that are often seen among more established regulators. So for example, you do have a certification process that's very standardized and evenly applied. You do investigate complaints and hold discipline hearings when you need to. There are conditions of education for continuing competency and the like. You have a public register of all of your members that you're required to share or that you do share. And in many cases, those are considered regulatory functions. However, under the PGA, some of those functions become much more prescriptive and much more detailed. And so that would have the effect of moving you along this continuum to sort of I'm stuck on heavy-handed. They're not heavy-handed, but the more deeper intervention of government into the work of your organization as a regulator. And so what we know from the literature is that the outcomes of regulation and regulatory decisions are going to be shaped not just by that yes or no decision of whether or not you're working under the PGA or if you maintain your current framework under the Societies Act, but how that regulatory framework is designed and how it's governed. And a lot of that will have to do with your decision as well as the regulations and the bylaws that the board then chooses to create. So that's an important piece that you'll need to keep in mind. The other piece that we found very clearly in the literature, and again, Bradley spoke about this when he talked about the broader context, is that there is definitely significant literature now that shows that increased government regulation, so moving to the right in this arrow, can really have unintended or even negative consequences. And as Bradley mentioned, this frequently has to do with professional supply, access to the professionals that the public needs access to, the impact on other professions, and even sometimes on the wages and access to jobs of the profession that's being regulated. So the questions of title protection and reserved practice, those are considered higher levels of government intervention than some of the pieces of regulatory work that you currently find under the Societies Act, and will certainly be considered by the OSPG and government as they balance out the need for public protection against considerations of possible negative or unintended consequences. Moving on, next slide, please. In terms of the environmental analysis and the jurisdictional scan, I'm going to focus on the right-hand column here about what we found out from the other jurisdictions, because Bradley's already covered the BC context and the broader societal factors at play in terms of making the decision to regulate or not. So I think one of the most important pieces as we looked at other jurisdictions internationally and also at all of the jurisdictions across Canada is that for the most part, with a few exceptions, the practice of professional planning around the world and in Canada is predominantly regulated by dual mandate associations that do work in the public interest and also work to support the profession of planning. So models that are very similar to what the PIBC currently has. Interestingly enough, though, what we have found that in Canada, very recently, there's been an increased movement to single mandate regulation, starting with, the BC Professional Governance Act, which doesn't include planners at this point, but clearly sets out a framework that could include planners. And then taking a look at what's happening currently in Alberta and in Newfoundland, where things are in transition. So Alberta originally had a model very similar to what you have right now with the BC Institute for Professional Planners, but there was recently a Professional Governance Act passed in Alberta, which changes things quite significantly. And that act was passed at the end of 2025. It'll be implemented in 2026, and there'll be a rolling implementation because the act is umbrella legislation covering a number of professions that are both in the natural resources sector and also outside of it, like accounting. It is an act that allows for mandatory registration, not just voluntary certification like you have. It allows for protection of title, which had already existed. And that act also allows for either the protection of a full scope of practice of a particular profession or for the protection of certain reserved acts. So it goes further than what we've seen in the PGA. And that will, as I said, it'll come into effect later this year and into 2027. How professional planners will be affected by this in Alberta remains to be seen. The regulations and the bylaws are still under development and they're not public right now, although you can read the act itself, that's publicly available. But as the current executive director works all of this out with the Alberta government, more will be seen, I think, probably by June or July of later this year. But it'll change things for professional planning in Canada. In Newfoundland as well, Newfoundland didn't have any kind of regulatory or association regulation to date, but they are introducing also an act, a Regulated Professional Planners Act, which will also serve as a single mandate public interest regulatory framework. But we don't know yet when that'll be implemented. So we've seen a subtle shift in Canada, and it makes us wonder whether that'll influence the position of the BC government or the Ontario Office of the Superintendent. Next slide. So now moving forward toward the more interactive pieces of our research. We did mention earlier that PIBC conducted 9 focus groups in the fall with 69 different members and non-members of the PIBC. And the purpose of those focus groups was really to hear directly from planners and to gauge their level of knowledge about the PGA, as well as what some of their issues are or concerns might be about professional legislation. So this slide tells you what I heard, what we heard in these focus groups. There was a wide variety of opinions that were expressed. And I would say that overall, the focus groups were incredibly thoughtful, and the participants really tried to work through some of the thornier issues. In the end, I think the conclusion is the decision to regulate or to seek regulation or not will really have to balance out some of the pluses that came out through the support for regulation, which include greater accountability, they include greater credibility, perhaps increased respect for the profession, the ability to have reserved practice, but that needs to be balanced out with the potential costs of regulation. And top of mind for the participants who were concerned about moving under the PGA was the loss of advocacy activities, both at a societal level more broadly and also advocacy for individual planners. There's also concern about equity and whether or not there'd be equivalent access to professional planners throughout the province and how that may impact smaller communities and Indigenous populations. There was also quite a lot of concern discussed in the focus groups about whether or not, if by seeking regulation, would PIBC lose its commitment to diversity and equity and become an elitist profession. Those are the words of some of the participants. And as Bradley mentioned, we don't think necessarily that the PGA would allow for discrimination or any kind of inequitable activity towards Indigenous communities, because the Act itself has institutionalized respect and acknowledgement for Indigenous ways of knowing. It's institutionalized in the legislation itself, anti-discrimination. So it may not, the impact of seeking regulation may not be as dire as what some of the focus group participants feared, but it still remains to be seen. Next slide, please. When I spoke with the key informants and built on the work that had been previously done with the regulators who had transitioned to the PGA and had been implementing their new ways of being for the last several years, the key informants really did address many of the questions or concerns that were raised in the focus groups. And you can see that the key informants' identification of the positive impacts of regulation, they were confirmed by some of the key informants, most of the key informants that we spoke with, including that, yes, it does give clarity to the mandate. Yes, it does cause a sense of greater professionalism and self-confidence for the profession. And reserved practice, if you haven't had it before now, could also be a very positive thing. But the key informants also emphasized some of the concerns that we heard about in the focus groups, including that this is really big change, that the loss of advocacy activities is not a small thing, and it might really be missed by the membership. There's a great deal of more complexity because it's very prescriptive legislation. So the work of reporting and auditing and potential investigation of your regulatory functions would increase. And most importantly, there have been operational costs that have been introduced by the legislative mandates and the increased number of complaints that were brought about by transitioning under the PGA. So the PIBC and the membership would really need to consider both the opportunity costs of seeking regulation as well as the actual increases to operational costs that could follow the greater structure and prescription of regulation under the PGA. These are all explored in greater detail in the report, but I'm just highlighting some of the main points here. The next slide, please. In the next section of the report, what we did is we integrated all of the findings from the research and the focus groups and the key informants to take a look at 4 possible options that are options that the Office of the Superintendent of Governance considers when an application for designation under the PGA comes forward. And those 4 options are listed here, and they range from maintaining the status quo, where the PIBC would continue as an association that does regulatory functions in its own way, to seeking regulation under the PGA, either with PIBC as the regulator or as another one of the existing regulators becoming the regulator that oversees professional planning, or the creation of a completely new organization that would serve as your regulator. So we've taken those 4 possibilities and applied the lenses that Bradley spoke about, 3 very different points of view from the PIBC members, a different analysis from the point of view of the organization, and then the 3rd level of analysis, which takes a look at the options from the government and possibly the public point of view. And in a minute, Bradley will talk about how some of those different points of view play out, because they don't always run in the exact same direction. Next slide. So I wanted to end my piece about the research by just showing you this diagram. So this circle here with the 4 quadrants represents those characteristics that the Office of the Superintendent of Professional Governance considers when they're completing their analysis and making their recommendations to the minister about whether or not a particular organization and a profession should be regulated under the PGA. And it ranges from the capacity of the organization historically, so both financially and in terms of infrastructure. They take a look at the body of knowledge and whether there are established training programs and mentorship and standards and a code. They do take a look at the nature of practice and whether the professionals are supervised or have existing mechanisms for promoting the public interest. And finally, as Bradley mentioned at length, they do look at residual risk. And those will be the types of things that the Office of the Superintendent will be taking a look at if you move forward with an application to seek regulation under the PGA. So we're not going to try to predict what would happen if you did that, but I'll hand over to Bradley and we'll end with some observations that will give you, I think, food for thought as you choose to move forward in this direction.
Great, thank you, Katya. I wanted to start just a couple of slides, then we'll throw it over. I see that there is some great questions coming, so I'll hand things over to Deborah and Raymond to kind of help facilitate those questions. But before I do, I just wanted to, part of our conclusion was that, looking at the decision that PIBC has to make, there's really at this point in time, 3 options. Option 1 is seeking additional information and engagement to address remaining uncertainties. So there still might be some gaps, some specific questions that members have that haven't been answered by the work that's been done. So there might be some targeted, specific additional information that the organization needs to make. I see, some people asking the question, like, what's the member's role versus the board's role in this decision? I think if more member engagement is required, then that's the type of information that we're talking about here. Option 2 is that the PIBC decides not to pursue designation under the PGA. So tools down, we've decided that this isn't right for us right now. But you have to remember that government also has the ability to force you to come under the PGA. If government believes that regulating your profession is in the best interest of the public, and for some reason they choose to force PIBC to come under the PGA, that is a possibility. So we could put a bit of a condition on option 2, just to say you determine not to pursue designation. However, the organization needs to be paying attention to these government currents. And if there starts to be some movement towards, on government side, regulating planners in a different way, then PIBC needs to re-engage in this process to ensure that you're not caught off guard, that you're asking for the right things, that you're able to engage in a process so that you're a good partner in that, and that you can move forward in a way that works for the profession. And then option 3 is that you proceed to apply for designation under the PGA. We're confident a lot of the information that we've flagged will be good information to incorporate into that application. But again, government is not looking at whether it's good for you. Government is really looking at what information can you provide us to show that there is a risk, that current processes are not managing that risk appropriately, and that professional regulation is the right tool in order to address that risk. So those are the 3 options. Some of the considerations that we have, and we spoke with the board about these things, but we thought that it would be good to flag for you too. PIBC, in our perspective, is doing a very good job at dealing with the risks some of the key risks emerging from your practice, from the professional practice. There is huge buy-in to the organization. You know, there's a lot of professions that where it's kind of voluntary. It's touch and go. The impact of the regulator of the association is really limited because there's not a lot of membership. Planners are proud to be a part of this profession. You become members, you're engaged. 130 of you show up for a webinar like this. Like, that is unique, and it means that you're doing a good job. That will work in your favor in a certain portion of this, in terms of, does this profession and organization have the capacity to be a PGA regulator? Yes. Where it may work against you, however, is that there's not necessarily a whole lot of big residual risks that are causing public harm that government is paying attention to, because you already have a process that's managing a lot of those risks. So your strength as an organization and a profession could work for you or against you, depending on where you are in this process. There are some broader policy objectives that align with designation that I think could work in your favor. The new Infrastructure Act, this new private members bill around professional reliance, both of them, what they talk about is, if more professions are regulated under the PGA and have higher standards of oversight, then perhaps in other types of processes, we can rely on those professionals and bypass traditional permitting processes or other processes in order to fast track certain infrastructure projects. So if planners were PGA regulated, there might be opportunities for fast tracking of certain things. Again, I don't know if it's a real direct connection, but government is looking through that lens right now of, would increased regulatory rigor actually allow us to rely more on those professionals in other ways. Saying that, I think there's other big policy objectives that could be working against this application. Housing affordability, regulatory streamlining, not to be seen as adding red tape right now, and labor mobility. One of the questions that's emerged is, how is this going to impact our relationship with other planners in other jurisdictions? Well, it could. If the rigor of your regulation is a lot higher than others, then all of a sudden you're creating barriers to entry for others from other provinces potentially. And there's a question about the Yukon as well. How might this impact planners in the Yukon? Well, if you become a PGA regulator, that has no jurisdiction over the Yukon, but something that the Yukon could do is say that in order to practice planning in the Yukon, you need to be a member of PIBC, which is a PGA regulator. But again, you may be heightening the type of standards and requirements that are required for the Yukon planners in order to fulfill that requirement. So again, it could have an impact on mobility for sure. I think the last piece I just want to say is, this isn't a simple decision. This is a tough decision. And it's, in our conclusion is that there's no clear right answer. And what we've heard, especially in the focus groups, is there's some really intelligent perspectives on either side. There's a really good debate around some of these issues, around what's best. But ultimately, I think that not everyone is going to be happy with the decision that is made, because there is some strong perspectives from very smart, reasoned people on either side. I think that regardless of the board decision, I think systemically, PIBC needs to pay attention, continue to pay attention to what the OSPG is doing. These types of dynamics that I talked about might start shifting, which might shift this equation and the decision making. So I think just continually paying attention as a profession to what's happening is really important. So that is our presentation. Again, high level. We encourage you to get access to the report and read the report. I did hear some good comments and questions just about it would have been nice to have the report before this so we could ask more questions. We apologize for that. That wasn't the process. We kind of wanted to deliver it all on the same day. But if there is questions emerging from some of the engagement, the surveys and things that we can help answer, we're happy to support you in any way. So maybe I'll hand things over to Deborah and Raymond to help facilitate the questions. Again, we're happy to answer any questions that are emerging. And I'll stop sharing. I apologize for my Zoom screw up. It's not the first time I've done that. I'll learn next time.
Well, thank you to Bradley and Katya for all of that information. Just to clarify, based on some of the information we've seen in the chat, the process today was really to introduce you to the report. So for Katya and Bradley to give you a broad overview of the report, and then following from that, making the report available, and then you have all kinds of opportunity to ask questions from that. So this survey, there are key questions in the survey that you'll see link directly to the report. So there is ample opportunity for you, PIBC members, to converse with us after the fact if you have any questions about that. I see there have been quite a few questions coming in. I thought I would take an opportunity, just based on some of the comments that I'm seeing, to just give you an overview of where we're at and why we're at this stage. So there was discussion at the board about the PGA and potential for joining or not joining. What would that look like for us if the province actually did decide to request that we become part of the PGA? So we started off with this particular phase, really looking at the engagement with the membership, getting your feedback on what this means. And part of that then was contracting with our consultants to get that background material so you have a full information leading up to what you think of this process and the PGA to this point. So we have done exactly that. We've provided all kinds of opportunities for the membership to engage with us. We have had the report come from our consultants, and you have the opportunity to base any questions from your review of that report. What we would like to do from this point forward is the subcommittee who have been steering this project will be looking at everything that we've garnered so far, including the consultant report, including the engagement opportunities that we've taken with you, and then going forward to the board and providing them all of this information, as well as the potential options that were listed in the consultant's report, along with the recommendations that the subcommittee will make. So really an all-encompassing direction for the board to consider potentially at their meeting in March. So that's where we're at. I did see there were some comments asking about the Tom Slutz report. So I just want to make it clear that to date, that report has been in camera with the PIBC board. It was a legal opinion that was provided to the board, so that information is not currently available to the membership. It is sitting in camera. The board hasn't given us any direction at this point in time to release that, but what I can say is the content within that report has been addressed and involved in all the engagement opportunities that we've had so far, including that learning perspective. So with that, I see we have a few minutes, so I'm just going to pull up some of the questions that have come through on the Q&A chat. There was one question here for Bradley and Katya. I know you talked about this a little bit, but is there anything else that you can add with respect to membership opportunities and any other impacts to membership there might be as far as the Indigenous topic is concerned. Can you provide any more information on that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I do think the PGA is not blind to these issues. Like, it's tried to incorporate some of the issues and awareness. It created some obligations on the superintendent to make sure that they're paying attention to certain issues. It has contemplated that if there is reserved practice, that it can't infringe on traditional, how do they frame it? Indigenous peoples exercising their rights related to cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, Indigenous sciences and technologies. So there is some contemplation around ensuring that this shift doesn't impact the ability of Indigenous people to be doing those activities. Saying that, I still think there may be a risk of access in terms of, how some people are entering into the profession at this time, and does this create more restrictions around that? Increased regulation often across the board results in decreased access and decreased numbers. And so that could be a risk. But I do think that it's not like the PGA has not contemplated some of those issues and they've tried to incorporate that into their framework.
Okay. There have been a number of questions here related to public interest and public trust. Would either of you have any comments on how those two, and I think they are two very different topic areas, public interest and public trust. Do you foresee any differences into how that might be perceived, whether you are self-regulated or part of the PGA?
Katya, do you have a thought on that?
So I do think that if we can learn from what some of the other regulators underwent and the changes that they experienced when they transitioned from being a dual mandate organization to regulation under the PGA, almost 100%, I would say, of those registrars indicated a sense of clarity that came with having a single mandate and addressing the perceived conflict of interest if you are regulating both in the interest of the profession and in the interest of the public. And so the key informants that we spoke with that are leading those organizations that have transitioned really felt that the issues of public trust and credibility before the public really increased. One of the things that all of them have experienced is an increase in complaints, which they attributed to a broader public understanding of what regulation is and a broader public understanding of what issues can be taken to a regulator that works in the public interest. So there seems to be an evolving consensus that a regulatory single mandate model does protect the public interest and public trust in a way that a dual mandate does not.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, if this is about building public trust in the profession, I think it is easier in terms of for regulators to communicate that. But if it's about, communicating the value of the profession, some of those things that associations find very important, I think there's more restrictions in terms of that type of communication because that's no longer the organization's job. That kind of strict line between advocacy and advocating for the profession, not just to government, but more broadly, versus advocating or speaking and communicating about the value of the regulator, the role of the regulator, how to file a complaint, expectations that you should have of the profession when you're working with that professional. Like the tone and nature of communication changes. And I think that's been a bit of a difficult shift. And it's also been difficult for registrants, not members. You change from being a member to a registrant of the college or of the organization. And that shift in communication and role has been a bit jarring for them. And some of the regulators have had to do a lot of work in change management with the registrants to make sure registrants now understand that the role of EGBC is very different than it was 6 years ago. So in terms of communication and public trust, there is a shift there that does happen.
And do you see any changes with respect to that notion of the public and public interest with some of the, as you mentioned, the private members bill that's come forward with Bill M216, depending on how that goes, and we know that they have not proceeded at this point in time. We're still waiting to hear the results of that. But would that have an impact then in terms of how the planning profession is viewed? Then what is the public interest depending on whether M216 moves forward? I believe we've also seen that similar legislation occur now, and I think it's Ontario. So what does that mean for the planning profession as a whole, I guess?
I'll provide some input, but I'm sure Katya has a perspective too, in that I do think it changes things. Like, I think it changes the equation a bit. And like some people have said in their questions, it could actually create more incentive for government to move forward with the regulation of a profession like planning under the PGA, because then it gives that benefit to use those planners and rely on them more. So I think it could change things for sure. It could change this equation. It also shares elements that the Infrastructure Act, which isn't a private member's bill, that did get passed, has. So the Infrastructure Act does have certain elements that allow government in certain circumstances, when there is a major infrastructure project, to bypass certain processes that if they can rely on a professional. And so again, I think both of those newish pieces of legislation do potentially shift some of the calculations. And I think it will be important that the board continues to monitor it.
Yeah.
Katya, anything more on that front?
I would just add that currently a lot of the conversations that we've been hearing do have to do with accountability and the lack of accountability for different individuals who are involved in planning work. And in particular, I heard quite a few folks in the focus groups discuss their frustrations that there is no accountability for people who are not RPPs and who are not members of the PIBC, and that there seems to be a bit of a lack of recognition that planning is actually a profession and a set of skills in its own right that can't just be, or maybe shouldn't just be, thrown open to anybody who wants to call themselves a planner. So the impact, I think, of the private members bill, if it were to continue to move forward, would balance out that that work could continue without government approval processes, because the public would be able to count on the accountability of the profession of registered planners who are regulated by an organization with a mandate to really take a hard look at the public interest. So that really adds to it's as Bradley said, the government then would be possibly more likely to want planners to be regulated and have a much stronger accountability structure than what is currently allowed.
And planners aren't alone. There's some other professions that I think would be moved to a higher priority level because of something like this as well. So again, nothing conclusive, but I do think you're right to be paying attention to it and to be thinking about and having conversations with government about what this might mean if that legislation moves forward.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for all of that information. I see we have quite a few questions here, but unfortunately, we are at the end of our time today. I want to thank everyone for attending and for all the interest that you've shown both through the chat and the Q&A session. As it turns out, we had 160 people attending today, so we really appreciate the input and the interest that we're seeing from our membership. I want to just let you know that our admin staff are on top of things. So both the report and the survey are now live on the website, so you can go have a look at that. I would really encourage everybody, just highly recommend that you take a look and go through the consultant report before you complete the survey. I think you'll find that's a good opportunity for you to provide us any further comments that you have on the report. So if you have any questions at all, please feel free to email PIBC at professionalgovernance@pibc.bc.ca. Ray is actually going to post the links into the chat box for you, so you'll have all the information there you need for contacting us and for following the links to the report and the survey. So thank you everybody for attending. Thank you to Bradley and for Katya. That was a lot of really good information. We really appreciate your efforts on all of this. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you soon at one of our next events.
Thank you. Bye-bye.